I'm joined by Professor Glenn Jeffrey, who is a professor of neuroscience at the University of College London in the UK. Now, we're going to talk about a range of topics, but Professor Jeffrey was one of the authors on a very, very exciting randomized control trial that showed the profound effect of red light in lowering blood glucose. And as someone who's interested in metabolic health and improving everyone's metabolic health, I think this is an absolutely pivotal trial. So, Professor Jeffrey, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Pleasure.
So tell us about your background briefly and how you got here.
Okay, my first degree was in experimental psychology at a time when experimental psychology was basically physiology and maths and not much else. But it had a big neuroscience bent, and I did that at University of Sussex. Then I did a doctorate at Oxford in neuroscience, and a postdoc in Chicago. And then after that, long period in Oxford before coming to University College London, where I have spent the majority of my professional career.
Great, and let's just launch straight into this trial that you've done that I alluded to earlier. What did you do to these subjects, and what was the finding?
Okay, so the core of my research is really mitochondria. Mitochondria provide the energy for all the things you do in life, and mitochondria, they make fuel, which is called ATP, and they make your body weight in fuel every day. So it's a massive, massive machine. And we know that we can influence mitochondria to slow them down or speed them up. But the critical thing is, if you speed them up, they need fuel themselves, and their fuel is sugar and oxygen. So if we work mitochondria hard, which we can do with light, they draw more sugar from your blood. So we've been working on light and mitochondria for ages. And actually, it was a colleague of mine, Mike Powner, said when we were driving to a meeting, said, if we shine red light onto people and make their mitochondria work harder, we should lower their blood sugars. And it was so obvious, but we hadn't thought about it. So to be honest, what we did first, we did exactly that experiment with bees, because bees are cheap and easy to organize. And we got a really, really super good result. You shine red light on a bee and its blood glucose goes down. So we did exactly the same on a group of subjects, healthy subjects. We took them and we gave them a standard blood glucose tolerance test. And that is where you drink a disgusting amount of glucose, really horrible. That sends your blood glucose up. And then we prick your finger every few minutes and test your blood glucose. It's a super, super simple experiment. So we did the controls first, and we found that their blood glucose peaked at about, around an hour after they drank the glucose. And then in the experimental subjects, we gave them a burst of red light. And then we initiated the experiment, got them to drink the glucose, prick their fingers, and we found that their blood glucose levels just didn't peak in the same way. They were significantly reduced. So we worked their mitochondria really hard. The mitochondria pulled that glucose, that excess glucose, out of your blood. And so we created a situation in which we lowered blood glucose. Conceptually, it's very, very simple. And the experiment was pretty simple as well.
And you measured carbon dioxide, and that is I think an important point to make. Can you explain the purposes of that and what you found?
Yes. So mitochondria, when they're working, they need glucose and they need oxygen. If you're burning oxygen, you're producing more carbon dioxide. So these poor people who we sat down, forced them to drink a lot of sugar water, pricked their finger every few minutes. We also put a tube up their nose and we measured the amount of CO2 they produced. And the amount of carbon dioxide they produced went up. And when we gave them a burst of red light, as with the blood sugars, we corrected the situation. So we had two independent metrics, and I should say we did this study between experimental group and a control group that weren't exposed. But then the experimental group, we went back to them and we retested them without the red light. So we actually got we got two facets to it, and it was the data. The data were very firm, rock solid. I was extremely pleased.
This is so exciting to me because the clinical implication of, or the clinical focus of improving metabolic health in lifestyle medicine is very much focused on diet. It's low carbohydrate, carnivore diet, which is an effective intervention. But there is no talk about light from those quarters. Whereas previous guests that I've had on this podcast, particularly Dr. Jack Cruz, has been saying for quite a long time that it's actually the light that is the most important factor in affecting metabolism via pathways such as this. So can you give us an idea about the magnitude of that blood glucose decrease, just so that we can get an idea?
It varied between people, but it's around 17%. I mean, that's not marginal. And I would add on to this. We haven't published this yet, but we're 3/4 of the way through a study on diabetic people with type 2 diabetes. We've got exactly the same result, absolutely the same result. So we wanted to pilot it in normal subjects first because it was easier to get the ethics, and we had the people all around us. But this is translatable. It is fully translatable. There are a number of other things around this domain that are worth paying attention to. So if you look at epidemiological studies, you find that people who spend much more time in daylight have much better regulation of their blood glucose than people who spend their time in an office environment. Light is key because it's the spectrum of light. So we give red light. We work mitochondria harder, they eat glucose. We can slow mitochondria down as well. So if we give blue light, that slows mitochondria down. And then when we do a blood glucose test, we haven't done this on humans, we've done it on animals. We give them blue light, we give them a blood glucose test, and their blood glucose peaks very high. So light is influencing metabolism systemically. And one of the issues we have in society now is that we're spending a lot of time indoors. We're also spending a lot of time under LED lighting. And LED lighting, it may not be obvious to people when they look at it, has a very big blue component and no red component whatsoever. So if you go out in daylight, there is actually a natural balance between blue and red. Although you can't see most of the red because it's beyond your region of sensitivity. Our vision really stops around 750 nanometers when we're on the border of infrared. But infrared light goes on to 2000, 2500 nanometers, and you can't see it, but it's having a big effect on your metabolism. So you drag people indoors, you change their lighting, and metabolism shifts, and that is only just beginning to be appreciated.
Yeah, it's a topic I've talked about at length on my podcast, which is this modern environment of.
Dr. Schwell, as a doctor, you have 4 board certifications, one of which is sleep medicine. So you spent a lot of time researching how light impacts us as human beings. And I know you're very excited about this topic. The average American spends 93% of our life indoors. That's 87% of our life is inside buildings, and another 6% on average inside automobiles. So tell us why you're so excited about this topic, and are we going to get some practical tips that we can implement right away?
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. I became excited about this because as I started to learn about what scientists are discovering, it was mind-blowing. I mean, we know about ultraviolet radiation from the sun and its role in producing vitamin D in our bodies. But there's a whole nother aspect to the light that we get from the sun and light that comes outside. For instance, the visible spectrum and how it affects us, the infrared spectrum and how it affects us. We are now starting to see what scientists are finding is amazing. And beyond the science of this, which we'll talk about, we're going to give you practical tips to harness that information and actually apply it to your body so that you can help optimize your immune system. And as you'll see, the results of that can also help in things like COVID-19 and general infections. But the information in this video, I believe, is so important that everybody needs to be able to understand this. And that's the reason why I'm so excited to talk to you about light. So to explain why light is so important to the human body, we've got to get down to the cellular level and explain this sort of at the outset. And to do that, I'm going to use an analogy to help explain what I'm talking about. So in every cell of our bodies, we have something called mitochondria. Mitochondria are like the engine in a car. It produces the power, the energy, and for the body, it produces ATP, which is the currency of energy for our body. But just like the engine in your car, it can overheat and it can shut down. And that's a byproduct of what it does. And it's a very similar situation that happens in the mitochondria. The mitochondria takes the food that you eat, the fats, the proteins, the carbohydrates, and it makes the ATP that your body needs. But a byproduct of that is oxidative stress. That's the heat around the engine that if the oxidative stress builds up too much, it can cause problems.
So what are some problems you can run into if you have too much oxidative stress?
What scientists have discovered and looked at over the years is that there are a lot of consequences to oxidative stress. Less optimal health, inflammation, cancer, dementia, diabetes, and learning disabilities have been tied to oxidative stress in the mitochondria and mitochondrial disability.
Okay, so mitochondria are in all of our cells, and you've given the analogy that they're like a car, that they can overheat and have problems. So a car's got a cooling system. What would be the cooling system, if you will, in our mitochondria?
So actually, the body has two different systems to be put in place that takes care of the mitochondria in terms of cooling it down or getting rid of the oxidative stress in the mitochondria, depending on whether it's day or night. And I think that's fascinating. Many of us know about what the cooling system is at night because we've heard of it before. And one of the things that is done is that melatonin, which is one of the strongest antioxidants that has been studied, it actually upregulates the glutathione system, is twice as powerful as vitamin E. Melatonin is secreted at night from the pineal gland, goes into the blood circulation, goes into the cells, and is actively transported in, and then goes into the mitochondria to fulfill its duty to mop up very efficiently these oxidative stress molecules.
Okay, let me see if I'm following this. So in the evening, melatonin's released from the pineal gland. And we've all heard that melatonin can help us sleep. People take melatonin as a sleep supplement. I know it's important for that, but you're saying it also goes into the mitochondria of our cells and combats oxidative stress?
That's exactly correct.
Okay, so that process works at night. How do mitochondria in our cells deal with oxidative stress during the day?
Well, that's a very good question because any type of light that hits the human eye is going to shut down the production of melatonin from the pineal gland. And so there has to be a completely different system that is put in place during the day that allows melatonin to be made in the mitochondria to deal with the oxidative stress. Remember, we said that these hydroxy radicals, these oxygen radicals that are produced in the mitochondria as a result of metabolism can destroy things immediately in its vicinity. So you need to have antioxidants right there on site. And so the question is exactly how does this happen during the day? And the answer is that infrared radiation from the sun, which we'll talk about, actually goes into the mitochondria and is producing melatonin on site. This is what the science is now starting to discover, making it very interesting as to how much sunlight are we getting and what happens when we don't get enough sunlight.
So is oxidative stress always bad for us?
No, oxidative stress can actually be beneficial if it's in the right place. So oxidative stress in the mitochondria is just going to serve to break down the proteins of the electron transport chain, which we'll talk about as we get into this lecture. But it's very important for cells, for instance, like white blood cells, which are responsible for killing bacteria, to have within them the ability to have oxidative burst and oxidative stress. So in certain places, at certain times, oxidative stress can be very beneficial. But in the mitochondria, no. The body needs systems in place to protect the mitochondria because it's doing a very important work.
Many of us have heard that not all light from the sun is visible light. So can you break down the solar spectrum for us?
Yeah, Kyle, let's take a look at the solar spectrum, which looks at the energy coming from the sun. Sometimes I don't like to use the word light, but I will use it because it assumes that light is something that we can see. But clearly, there is energy coming from the sun, which we cannot see. And that's important to understand. As we look here at the solar spectrum, you'll see that 39%, just 39% of the energy coming from the sun is in the form of visible light. And we can see that here between 400 nanometers and 760 nanometers wavelength. We'll talk about wavelength. And so you can see everything to the right of red is known as infrared because it has a wavelength longer than red. And that is divided up into near infrared and far infrared. We'll talk about this more later. Don't get too concerned about this. But specifically, we're going to talk more about near infrared and its benefits. And that's between 760 nanometers and 1400 nanometers. We'll come back to that. At the other end, all of the light, as you can see, that is beyond the purple or violet in this case, ultraviolet is not seen, but we know that it's important, specifically UVB is important in making vitamin D. But I want you to notice something very important. 54% of all the energy coming from the sun is in the infrared spectrum. Remember that, we're going to come back to that.
Okay, so the sun is putting out a lot of energy, and of that energy, a spectrum of that is visible light. Are there other aspects of visible light that we need to know about at this time?
Yeah, so in order for us to give recommendations and for us to be able to measure the effect of light, one of the things that's really important is understanding what lux is. And so we've got an example here where we have a candle, which is 1 lumen, 1 meter away from a board, which is 1 meter by 1 meter, and that's described as 1 lux. I'm saying this because we're going to be using lux a lot, so you have to understand that 1 lux is pretty dim light. In fact, let's talk a little bit about some different examples so you can understand what lux really is. And in this slide here, you can see that 1 lux is kind of like twilight at night, and that a family living room is about 50 lux, but it can go all the way up to 1,000 if you had an overcast day outside. And if it was a bright and sunny day, that would be around 100,000 or even more lux. And so that kind of gives you an idea when we talk about exposing your eyes to light at a certain lux level. This is a good reference point for understanding light and its intensity. With that information now, we're ready to talk about light and how it affects the human body. This is going to be divided into 2 parts. The first part is going to be what happens at night, how we divide the night from the day, and how sleep and the circadian rhythm is affected by light. The second part is going to be on how light affects us directly with infrared radiation and the mitochondria. And I think that's going to be the part that for most of you, you've probably never heard before. So stick with us as we go through this. There's going to be a lot of interesting, informative aspects of this talk. But first, let's talk about how sleep and the circadian rhythm is affected by light. So if you've ever been to a concert, you know that the conductor is the one that's conducting the orchestra, and each one of those players in the orchestra is starting at the beginning of their music and playing their instrument. They all have to start at the same time, otherwise the music is not going to sound right. So in the body, there are many different types of processes going on. There is a violin in one portion of the body. There is a tuba going on in another portion of the body, to use that analogy. But to make sure that everything is working in unison, there has to be a conductor, a master clock, and that is known as the circadian rhythm. So I want to show you this slide that describes the circadian rhythm. Now, it looks rather daunting, and that's actually part of what I want to show you, is to show you how many things that are going on in the body have to be coordinated. I want you to think of, let's say, Disneyland. You know that you can go to Disneyland in the morning and you can go throughout the day and all of those rides and attractions are running. But you know that as soon as Disneyland closes down at night, and I had a friend that used to work at Disneyland, there's so many things that happen behind the scenes and after hours to make sure that the park is ready to go the next day. The trash has to be taken out, things have to be cleaned out. It's a new day that's about to happen. And the same thing happens in the human body. The human body is extremely complex. And because of that, there are so many processes that are occurring that it's not just one continuous thing. There are times of the day where certain things tend to happen and times of the day when other things don't. So I wanted to show you here what I'm referring to. And just to give you an example of what we talked about with oxidative stress, we can see here that melatonin secretion starts at 2100. That's about 9 o'clock at night. We call that dim light melatonin onset, because if you are watching dim light, then it's going to basically start to secrete melatonin from the pineal gland. But if you notice, as we go around this cycle, melatonin will stop at approximately 7:30 in the morning. It's interesting because around that time, cortisol levels start to peak. And they go around and finally die out at around the time that melatonin is starting to come on. We'll talk more about that cycle. But if you just look here, and you don't need to know this stuff, but you can just see, for instance, that your fastest reaction time is around 15:30. That's about 3:30 in the afternoon. We know that your highest alertness is around 10 o'clock in the morning. Your best coordination is around 2:30 in the afternoon. All of these things are happening because there is a master clock that's coordinating all of the smaller clocks to be on at the same time.
Okay, Dr. Schwell, a couple questions. Number one, you said melatonin secretion starts at about 9 p.m. But I imagine it's variable from person to person and also, of course, depends on whether or not they're viewing bright light at night. And the second question is, you mentioned the dim light melatonin onset. Is it actually the viewing of dim light that stimulates melatonin release, or is it just the absence of viewing bright lights that actually stimulates melatonin to be released?
Yes, both good questions. Dim light melatonin onset is kind of a bad name for it because really it's the absence of light that allows the pineal gland to stimulate and produce and secrete melatonin throughout the blood and the human body. You're right that it may not be 9 o'clock in everybody, and that's the problem, is this circadian rhythm has to fit onto reality. This is a clock that's going on inside your body. But the problem can come in is if your clock is not in tune with what reality is on the outside. In other words, there's a certain part of your body, your circadian rhythm, that's attuned to when you should be awake. And if it's not correlating with when the sun is up, you might have some problems. So yes, the circadian rhythm, which is very finely regulated inside the body, but the question is it actually in line with what's happening outside the body, what reality is? And that's the question.
You mentioned that it's key that our internal clock, our circadian rhythm, is optimally aligned with reality, and that there's all kinds of potential benefits and consequences to that. What are some of the specific things that our circadian rhythm regulates?
Well, if you look at this list, this is pretty extensive, Kyle. I mean, circulating melatonin, we know as an antioxidant. There's studies that suggest that it can reduce cancer. It reduces cortisol production, which is what you don't want to have at night, which is good. It's an antioxidant and it promotes sleep. That's just the melatonin aspect. But the circadian rhythm also is used in regulation with peripheral clocks, the feeding and the fasting rhythms, right? So you're not typically eating at night, you're eating during the day. And so those are coordinated. We have hormones that go throughout the body like cholecystokinin, leptin, and ghrelin. These are involved with diet. These are involved with being hungry and with being satisfied. Body temperature, glucose metabolism, the pancreas, and you can see some of the other ones there. Vasopressin, which is a blood pressure hormone that determines when your blood pressure should be high and when it should be low. Obviously, you want it lower at night when the body is resting. Acetylcholine is a very major neurotransmitter. Cortisol, we've talked about already. Insulin is involved in diabetes. Adiponectin, which is involved with adipose tissue and fat. And then, of course, just overall metabolism regulation, which is going to vary depending on the time of day. So it's really important that the circadian rhythm is in sync and is well regulated. And you asked about consequences. There's been a number of studies that have been done both in rodents and in humans that when they apply the dysregulation of the circadian rhythm in rodents, we can see problems with body temperature, increased fat, altered immune system, tumor developments, and basically just perturbations of the hormonal homeostasis. In human beings, when they do this prospectively, they show that there are problems with insulin regulation, leptin, and norepinephrine, and also increased markers of inflammation and diabetes. So there's a lot of problems when you have dysregulation of the circadian rhythm.
You mentioned leptin. What is that?
Well, leptin is a hormone that regulates your hunger. There's two hormones there. There's leptin, which makes you feel satisfied, and there's ghrelin, which increases your need for food. You feel more hungry, basically. And so when you're not sleeping at the correct time, when your circadian rhythm is off, you're going to feel hungry and probably eat more food. If you have too much ghrelin or not enough leptin, you're going to also feel hungry and eat more food. So there's a problem there when your circadian rhythm is not in sync.
So again, you've mentioned the importance of matching our circadian rhythm with what's going on outside in the world. So how do we do that? What are some strategies that allow us to do that effectively?
Well, what you have to understand is that the body is hardwired to be able to take information from the environment and to change its internal circadian rhythm so that it's in sync with the environment. And this slide here tells exactly how that happens. So as you can see here, when light hits the eye and specifically goes to the retina, and I want to specifically say that we know that light that goes to the retina is hitting rods and cones, and those go to neurons, which then project back here to the occipital lobe, and that's where we actually can understand and visualize and see things. What I'm about to talk about is a completely different section of the retina, and it does it in a completely different way. The first thing you have to understand here is that there is light that we see, that we can describe. What I'm about to talk to you about is light that comes into the eye that goes to a completely different part of the brain, and it's not light that you're conscious of. It's light that you're unconscious of, and that's important to understand. This light that's coming into the eye is not going to rods and cones, but instead this thing called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. Now, these are ganglia. They are particularly in the inferior portion of the retina at the back of the eye, and that's important to understand because usually light that comes from the superior visual field when it hits the lens is going to be projected down into the inferior retina. So this is going to be stuff in the superior visual field. It is then projected to something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Now, this is the master clock. This is the portion of the brain that makes sure that everything is working in sync. This is the conductor of that orchestra that I showed you at the beginning. When light comes in, it's telling the suprachiasmatic nucleus that it is daytime, that it is during the day, that this must be coming from the sun. This is how we are hardwired. And because of that, there is a specific neuron that shuts down production in the pineal gland of melatonin. And so light coming into the eye goes to the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. That's a long word there. And it gets projected not to where you would actually see consciously you would see light, but rather to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which tells it that it's daytime and therefore tells the pineal gland, do not make melatonin, because melatonin in the blood system is a signal to the cells that it's nighttime and it's time to go to bed. And so this is how the system, the circadian rhythm, understands that it is daytime versus nighttime. Now, there's actually more to this because obviously it's possible for you to be out of sync. So the question then becomes, how does the brain and the circadian rhythm inside your brain adjust to reality? So I want to show you how the circadian rhythm in your brain can be shifted one way or the other depending on the external sources of light. So I want you to imagine that you're on a desert island, that you have no sort of extrinsic sources of light, and you're perfectly aligned. You can see here that the night of the circadian rhythm is actually aligned with night, which is reality. And also the daytime is perfectly aligned with reality, which is day. That's the ideal. In our situation, if we were to, for instance, expose our eyes to the screen or our iPhone or anything like that, what could happen is that we would start to expose our eyes to light at a time where we would not normally be experiencing light. And so what the circadian rhythm wants to do in that situation is it's thinking that it's still daytime. And as a result of that, it's going to shift itself over to that to encompass and capture that because it thinks that it's too early. And so you can see here very clearly that exposure to light at night after the sun goes down has a tendency to delay your circadian rhythm. Now, that can cause problems, as we've talked about before, but the biggest problem that you might notice yourself consciously is that even though you're at night here, your circadian rhythm is not ready for sleep. And so you might actually get the symptom of insomnia. And also, similarly, it's day here at the beginning, and you're still in the middle of your sleep. And so you might get hypersomnia in the morning. And you can see here that it's important to understand that avoiding light, especially late in the circadian rhythm, after the sun has gone down before you go to bed, avoiding it can prevent this type of shifting from occurring. Interestingly also is exposing your eyes to light here in the beginning of the day can help anchor your circadian rhythm and prevent it from sliding later and later because of viewing of light in the late hours. But I will say that making sure that you expose your eyes to bright light in the morning is not a substitute for avoiding bright light in the evening.
Okay, to summarize,